My niece for Christmas gave me a decal that says this on it: "Be careful or you'll end up in my sermon." I think that's just perfect for me, because if I find out something that you've done, if I can use something, use it in an illustration, I'm going to use it. I consider it free game if I can do that. But if you think about it, none of us do something that's crazy or bad or think it's going to have a long impact, and at the time think that we're doing that. We don't think that it's going to show up so many days, months, weeks, years down the road. You think about it. You've heard the phrase Ponzi scheme. Well, that's actually named after a man named Charles Ponzi, who started a scheme back in the 1920s where he raised, actually in that day, in the 20s, raised $15 million. Well, of course, it was all a scheme, and he got caught and went to jail. But for a long time, he lived a good life. And so anytime you see that somebody's running a racket, it's very likely called a Ponzi scheme. Does Enron ring any bell to you? You remember back in around 2001, Enron, a company that the stock was just going crazy. It was so high, and the people who worked there and people who had invested just thought they had portfolios for retirement that was just going to make them millionaires. But in the end, they come to find out it was all smoke and mirrors. And they lost $74 billion, investors did. 401ks just wiped out. How about the name Bernie Madoff? Most of us have heard of that. It was a man who worked for 20 years running hedge funds and thinking people were getting money and were building up great money and great returns. But in the end, it turned out it was all fake. And they lost $64 billion. No one thinks that what they're doing is going to be the thing that they're going to be remembered for, or something infamous they're going to be remembered for. One of my favorite phrases is what somebody said. It's on a tombstone of a guy. The last words were, "Hey y'all, watch this." And that's kind of famous. That's our last words if we're doing something pretty dangerous. Have you ever wondered why, when you look on products that you buy or places that you go and you see these warning labels and warning signs, you go, why in the world are they on there? I looked up some of them. Like you can go into a bathroom and it says, "Please flush." Why do they need to put a sign up that says, "Please flush"? Because somebody before them didn't flush. So you need to instruct them to flush. I saw this one on a chainsaw. It says, "Do not hold chainsaw on wrong end." You know why they had to put that? You got it. Somebody did. On a hairdryer, it says, "Do not use while asleep." Figure that one out. Somebody had left a hairdryer running while they were asleep. This is a good one. On pepper spray. Pepper spray. It says, "May irritate the eyes." I think that's the whole purpose. Now I love this one. A baby carriage. Had a picture and a warning label on it. "Please remove child before folding." You know why it's there? Because somebody folded up their child in the chair. Our Core 52 memory verse for this week, our foundational verse, is found in 1 Samuel 16:7. And it says this: "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." How did we get to a point that God needed to point this out to a prophet named Samuel? You know the answer. Even if you don't know the story, you know the answer. Because there was something, some event, some incident that has just happened, that somebody made a mistake by looking at the outward appearance. Didn't judge by the heart. So how did we get there? That's what I want us to do today, is to go back and retrace how we got to where a statement like this needed to be made. We're kind of going to work in reverse here. If we go back to the beginning of this, Israel wants a king. Israel wants a king. God had always wanted and just treasured the relationship that it was God leading mankind, the people that he loved. And he had set up a way to communicate and lead his people. It was God speaking through an earthly person, a prophet, and it was to the people. And this worked, and it had always been that way. Remember last week we talked about Moses, that he was the greatest prophet that there'd ever been. He spoke for God. But something is about to change on the landscape and the history of Israel. So we're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 and 5, and trace this story. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old." Can I just stop right there a minute? You know, if you're going to somebody with an important issue, you don't need to start with a statement like, "You are old." But this is what they did. It says, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." There's so much in this verse and so much that we can look at here. But we can see that where the verse reveals where the people are leaning, where they're heading in their relationship with God, about a decision that they want made. They don't think Samuel can cut it much longer. He's old, remember, and they're not too impressed with his sons. But we're going to see, as we read more verses, that right here they revealed their real heart. They said, "We want a king like everybody else has. We want to be like the other nations." And if you read this whole section, and I hope you will, if you haven't already, you're going to see that they wanted somebody to lead them in battle, to be a military leader. Something had happened in their way of thinking that they would rather have a visible king rather than invisible God. Samuel doesn't like it at all, and he goes immediately to God and tells God of their plan like God doesn't know, but he reveals this and requires of God what he should do with this request that he's getting from the people. And God tells Samuel, he says, "This is a mistake, but listen to the people. If this is what they want, listen to them. But you must first warn them what a mistake they're making." And Samuel goes back and tells them, he says, "You people don't know what you're doing. There's going to be taxes upon taxes now, and they'll confiscate lands, and they'll take your sons and daughters to work for the government. They'll send your sons off to war." Now, of course, this wasn't going to happen immediately, but this is exactly what we saw happen and what you always see in a nation. But they wouldn't listen. Look what it says in verses 19 and 20. "But the people refused to listen to Samuel. 'No,' they said, 'we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles.'" You recognize this group? I mean, I don't even think you need to be old school to recognize these guys. The Beatles. The Beatles, they burst on the American music scene around 1964. They came over, did a couple of concerts, and their popularity was just beginning to explode in Europe. And they came to America, did a couple of concerts that were completely sold out. They went on the Ed Sullivan Show, and the ratings showed that 40% of all Americans were viewing the Ed Sullivan Show and saw the Beatles. It was in no short time, or no long time, that the top 5 hits on the music charts, top 5, all belonged to the Beatles. That's unbelievable. But it turned out to be more than just music. The Beatles changed the culture of America. They changed hairstyles. They changed fashion because everybody wanted to be like them. They changed music. They changed the way bands performed and the way they played their instruments and the way they did harmony. The Beatles were unbelievable. But the interesting thing is, they changed all of the American culture, but they changed it by being different. This is so true of everything, from music, the Beatles, to kings, to Christians. We don't change things by just fitting in and being just like the rest of the world and the rest of everybody else. But this is exactly what we see that the Israelites want to do. They just want to be like everybody else. And so the search for a king begins. And God directs Samuel to go to Bethlehem. To go and meet a king. Or I'm really messing up. To go and look for this king. And he says, I'm going to send a young man your way. And his father's name is Kish. So you see in 1 Samuel 9:2, it says this. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than all the others. He stood out among all the Israelites. And mentioned he was he was a tall, probably handsome, impressive young man. God decides to give Israel what they want, not what they need. And as you read over the next 4 chapters, the story of Saul, you're going to see that Saul started off really good. He started off humble. He wanted to serve God. He was a military leader and he was successful. He won many battles. But something began to change and he began to think more about himself than he did about God. And he saw God as a means to an end, a way to promote himself. And he began to make bad decision after bad decision. And he became very quickly a bad leader. In 1 Samuel 15, Samuel receives the word from God. It says, go to Saul and tell him that I want him to go up to battle against the Amalekites. Now the Amalekites were people that when God was leading the people out of Egypt, and there's moving like 1 million people, that some of the people were weaker and they straggled behind. And it says the Amalekites would pounce on these people and kill them and rob them. God has never forgotten this great injustice. And he says now it's time to pay for this great sin. And it wasn't just that. The Amalekites were a very evil, evil people. Always had been. There was no sign that anything was going to change. So God said, it's time to bring justice to these people. I want you to go to battle, and everyone that you come in contact with, I want you to destroy. I want you to kill the animals. I want you to destroy everything. It was a ban had been put on the people, on the nation of the Amalekites. And so Saul's orders were very clear. Completely destroy these people. This is what it says in verse 9. But Saul and the army, and they went out and they were victorious. God had already guaranteed them they would win. But Saul and the army spared Agag, that's the king, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. You see the contrast of what God said for them to do and what Saul and his army did? Let's keep going, verses 10 and 11. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was troubled and he cried out to the Lord all that night. It says that God was grieved. Some people translate it as regret. He regretted. But God had not made a mistake. He knew what Saul was going to be. He says that he was grieved. And what grieves God? It's when somebody can't be used by him any longer. That they reach a point that that God cannot work with them any longer. And he says he was grieved. And Samuel is upset. And he prays all night about Saul. Look at verse 12. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul. But he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone down to Gilgal. I thought this battle was God's idea. I thought it was God's plan. I thought God was behind all this. Did he set up a monument to God, to the brave soldiers, to the people? No, he said he set up a monument to himself for this great victory. Verse 13. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." Just upon meeting Samuel, he just burst forth from this. Now that kind of reminds me of a kid when you walk in the room and something's broken and you walk in and they immediately says, "I didn't do it." Seems like Saul is just getting those words out as quick as he can to maybe throw Samuel off. But look at verse 14. But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Mary Lane Baker called me this week or texted me this week and he said, "This sounds," and says, "This kind of sounds like sarcasm." And she had looked up in a commentary and somebody's called it holy humor. It's like, and you see the sarcasm, the humor in this. And he says, "Well, if you killed everything, how come I hear sheep? How come I hear cattle?" If it wasn't so tragic, it would be hilarious. Saul answered this way. He said, "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." He throws the soldiers under the bus. He puts it all on them. And their excuse, it becomes his excuse for the disobedience. It is then that Samuel tells Saul that God has removed his protection from him. He tells him that, "Saul, you may be king, but God is no longer behind you in this." And it went on. Saul remained king for a number of years, but God was no longer pleased with Saul. He no longer was his man on the scene, and he no longer communicated with Saul. And it even says that from that day forward, Samuel never went to be with Saul. What are some takeaways from this story? As remember, we're working our way back to our core verse that we read at the beginning. What are some takeaways? Well, one is this. As followers of God, as Christians, we are set apart. We will never lead anyone. We will never influence anyone if we're just trying to be like everyone. When we respond the same way that the rest of the world does, with hate or envy or not being willing to forgive, not being willing to admit when we're wrong, when we've made mistakes, we'll never influence anyone. How many of you enjoy going to the DMV or going to the driver's license office? And that's no cut to those people that work there, but none of us enjoy it. I had an appointment set up last week to go and get my driver's license renewed. And through this COVID atmosphere, you have to make an appointment so far out in advance to even get in. And I got there and I talked to the lady and what we were going to do. I told her what I wanted to do, and I mentioned that I wanted to upgrade my license to the Real ID. And most of you know what that is. That's just a higher level proving who you are, and you can fly without showing your passport and go into federal buildings and things like that. Well, when we got to the end, and you have to provide some documentation and prove that you are who you say you are. When we got to the end, she had not asked me for any of that. And she said, "Okay, you'll get your license in the mail." I said, "You don't need to see my birth certificate or anything?" And she said, "No, why?" I said, "Well, for the Real ID." She says, "You wanted the Real ID?" And it was at that moment, was she going to say that it was my fault that I didn't tell her what I knew I had? And she said this, she goes, "All I can say is that I'm sorry. That was my fault. I can't make an excuse except that I messed up." And she says, "I can't redo your license on the same day. It's already been issued. So can you come back tomorrow?" I was so blown away that somebody just right up front didn't try to make excuses, didn't try to blame it on me, but just took full responsibility. I was wrong. I made a mistake. I said, sure, don't worry about it. I'll be back tomorrow morning. You know, we need to stand out. We need to be different. You know, we need to be the people who do it different than the rest of the world. We need to seek God's approval more than man's. We need to care about Him more than we care about ourselves. When Saul learned this from Samuel, he begged Samuel to accompany him so he could to stay with me as I go back to the people. He says, so it will look good for me. He had just been told that God is removing his preference for him, that he was no longer going to communicate to him, and all he cared about was how's this going to look to the people. You know, we've got to get past that. We've got to work for God's fame, not our fame. Saul built a monument to himself. That tells us something right there. That what he was doing and where his focus had changed. Let me ask you a question that may seem very strange to you. But why are you a Christian? Why do you live the Christian life? Well, if it's just for your benefit, if I'm just living the Christian life for my benefit, I think we've made a huge mistake. We live for God's fame. We live for His honor. I live as close to what He's taught me to live, not for my benefit, but for my King's benefit. Think about that. That's another takeaway, another lesson we can learn from this, is that partial obedience is not obedience. I'm not talking about perfection here. I'm talking about obedience. Talking about the effort. Talking about the heart of the person. Partial obedience puts us in an unwinnable situation. At some point, we have to choose between ourselves and God. And when we get into that survival mode, it makes us do some very sketchy things. It causes us to lie. It causes us to lie to ourselves. We begin to make excuses for our failures. We won't take responsibility. Saul blamed it on the soldiers. This couldn't be my fault. And if you read through this section, like I was mentioning, you're going to see all along the way, Saul eventually blamed soldiers. He blamed his son Jonathan. He blamed David. And he even blamed Samuel. It causes us to lie to others when we get into this survival mode. Saul lied to Samuel about what he had done. It causes us to lie to God. I called it holy humor a while ago. But he flat out just lied to God and said, I've made these sacrifices, when God had not. God knew his heart, but he was still trying to lie to God. Now God is about to choose a new king. And like Samuel said, you may be king for a while longer, but you're not God's anointed king. You're not going to be the one that God leads in this. So he sends Samuel to the house of a man named Jesse, who happens to live in Bethlehem. And he tells him that he says, you'll choose one of Jesse's sons, and I'll show you which one to be the next king of Israel. And so Samuel has Jesse to bring all of his sons out and to march them by him one at a time. And in 1 Samuel 16, verses 6 and 7, it says this. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. This is where it's at. He said he sees this first young man. And I don't know what he looked like, but he must have looked like a king. Because he says, Lord, surely this is the one you want. And now we're right back to where we started today. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And this is the last takeaway that I want us to talk about today. It's simply this. We got to get past the surface. We got to go deeper. We've got to become deeper people. We've got to stop being so shallow in how we see everything. The Israelites wanted a king to start with because they had become so shallow. Think that, listen to this, they had become so shallow in their thinking about God, and how they made judgments about the rest of the world. And they wanted an earthly king because they didn't want a godly king any longer. They had lost total vision of what God was about, what God had done for them. They were so shallow they forgot this. Last weekend, Janice and I were stopped at a store and we went in. We're just going to pick up a few things, and it was pretty crowded when we went in. And as we're shopping a little bit, she went her way, I went mine, and we were just picking up a few things. And I heard some voices really loud, but I thought they were just being obnoxiously loud, and they were playing and talking across the store to each other. But I never turned and looked at them. I could just hear the voices. And Janice and I got up to the checkout line, and this is going on in the background, but I'm really not paying a whole lot of attention to it. And a very professional young woman, checks us out. She's polite. She checks us out. She takes our money. She gives us our change. She gives us a receipt, hands us our bag, and just thanks us so much for shopping there. And about that time, it finally realized to me that these people aren't playing. They're about to get into a throwdown. They're about to get into a fight because the loud voices had turned into some very crude language. And it's like, oh my goodness, we're going to be right in the middle of a fight. And it's like, I didn't even hardly realize that she had walked past me, but it was this young lady, and she was a short lady, walked past me and went right up in the face of this man that was being so rude and crude and saying what he was going to do to this other person. And she went right in his face, looked right up at him, and she said, if you're going to be disrespectful, you got to get out of my store. And he says, I'm not talking to you. And she said, I don't care who you're talking to. You're not going to act like this, and so get out of my store. And I'm just like, oh my goodness. Janice already walked out of the store, cranked the car, and left. I had to run down Greenville Boulevard just to catch up. Now, it wasn't that bad. But the guy left. This little petite lady, young woman, stood up. She was the last person I would have thought that would have been the one to bring calm to that situation and to stand this guy down. But she did. I judged by the surface. I just looked at her height. I looked at her age, and I didn't think she would be the one to do it, but she was. Saul looked good on the outside, but he wasn't good on the inside. Saul was more concerned with the outside than he was with the inside. And now it appears that Samuel needs to be warned again. Don't judge by the outside. He said, this is not the one. And one by one, the sons walked by, and Samuel would say, surely this is the one, Lord. And God just said, no. And eventually it came down to that it was a young son who was still out in the field, that the father didn't even take the time or the bother to bring him into the fields because he knew he wouldn't be the one. And we know that it turns out to be David. And when he came in, God says, he is my new king. He is the new one. It's not a sin to be beautiful. It's not a sin to be handsome. It's not a sin to be muscular and well-built or talented or rich or popular. All the things that we see on the outside, it's not a sin. But it is a sin when that's all we see. It is a sin when that's all we care about, whether it's in somebody else or ourselves. How many problems in our world are caused because we don't take the time to go deeper, to get past the surface? That we make judgments all about the surface. How many problems in your life, in my life, in the world are because we do not take the time to get past the outer, the exterior of a person or an issue? How do we see God? Do we just see God on a surface level and we never get to know Him? This is advice for every one of us. We got to get past those things. We have to become deeper people ourselves. You know, a page is about to turn in Israel's history. A page is about to turn in what a king really is to look like. They're about to meet a king named David. You know what's so interesting is that David is going to make some of the same mistakes that Saul did. He's going to make some mistakes that were worse than Saul. But the difference is going to be that this was a man who cared about God. This is going to be a man that had a heart for God. He loved God. He took responsibility for his own sins and his own actions. And although he was far from perfect, he always had God's fame, God's honor, God's glory in the forefront of everything that he did. That's what's going to separate David from Saul. Now today I just want to leave you with this thought and this question here. Is if God sees the heart and he judges by the heart, maybe today is the day that we start taking seriously how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we see the rest of the world. You know, you need to be careful. You may end up in a sermon. And if we're going to end up in a sermon, let it be because we have a heart for God, like David, and not like Saul. God bless you this week. God bless you in serving God and loving people the very, very best that you can. We'll see you next time.